All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first in a four-part series of webinars, the Jean Monnet webinars. This is in conjunction, as you'll see in a few slides, with the foreign policy course entitled Quo Vadis European Union, which is part of the Euromaster course offered here at the IES. And today we're going to be divided across the first block of that course, as you can see, but just a word or two on the module itself, Quo Vadis European Union. It is a three-year Jean Monnet funded course exploring all of the facets of EU foreign policy, and it operates as part of the Masters in European Integration and Development, which we affectionately know as the Euromaster course. Because European foreign policy is so broad and so substantial an area of study, we decided to expand it from one term to two terms, a two-term course, therefore, for the Euromaster students who generally come to the course with some background and certainly a general interest in the role of the European Union as an international actor, but at the end of it have a profoundly clearer understanding of the institutions. And certainly for this first block, the theory that underlies the decision-making and also the philosophy of European action abroad. It's divided into four key parts, roughly 2 parts per term. And the webinars are a sort of a blended learning offering that accompanies the traditional classroom learning, which we do every Friday at the VUB from 6 o'clock onwards. And also as part of the Quo Vadis European Union module, there is a final public colloquium this year. We had it as part of the 10th anniversary of the Institute for European Studies, and in 2013 we need to decide, hopefully with student input, what the nature of that public colloquium is going to be, and also when it's going to take place. Therefore, the overall look, if you like, of the course, Quo Vadis, meaning, whither goest thou, where is the European Union going, certainly looking at the broad and very complex relationships between the European Union and the rest of the world. And for those who are taking the course formally, and also welcome to those who are not, the idea, I think, is to look, based on the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty, at the ability and sometimes the inability of the European Union to make a decent impact in its neighborhood, to, as we have here, to unleash its foreign policy potential, and to do so in a way that balances the tools and philosophies at its disposal, but also to countenance quite seriously the risks of and the constraints of a variety of internal obstacles and external obstacles as well. And so I think one of the overall questions that the students are consistently asked to think about in the course is the extent to which the EU, of course, is a quote-unquote actor in international affairs. And I'll very briefly this morning touch on ways in which we can try to conceptualize that. And this, I think, is related to two further sub-questions. The first, the broad policies by which the European Union itself defines actorness and European Union actorness, and the way in which it has constructed itself as a foreign policy actor locally, regionally, in the neighborhood, and globally as well. And more importantly, I think even than that, the particular instruments that it has endowed itself with by which it conducts its external affairs as well. Here's a snapshot, therefore, of the dates of the current and following webinars for Quo Vadis European Union. Today, again, we're going to be looking at the definitions and also the international relations theory that acts as a substructure, a conceptual substructure beneath the teaching of the course. On the 5th of December, do please take note in your diaries, we're going to be looking, of course, reviewing the role of the European Union institutions and the way in which they operate as vehicles of EU foreign policy activeness. And then the final two taking place actually in 2013, just notice the year should roll ahead there, looking at the foreign policy vehicles close to home, further abroad with regards to the neighborhood, and then even further abroad with regards to strategic partners like Russia and China and Canada. So, you're going to have me very briefly this morning, followed in exactly the same order as the class was presented to you in the classroom. Alexander talking about Realpolitik, and Joachim talking about Neoliberalism, and Katja joining us from Amsterdam just to show you the full extent of the range of webinars to discuss and touch base again on constructivism and social learning and the impact on the European Union. So, without further ado, I'd like to get you to cast your minds back a couple of weeks to the very first lecture in which I tried to set the stage for EU foreign policy. And one of the key structures that I invited you to look at and to ruminate upon was the use of the word actorness and the conceptual implications of that actorness by Brotherton and Vogler, the British pairing who came up with this in their first edition back in, I think, 2006. In addition to that, although I'll touch on this again in a minute, two of the readings for that first week present a sort of counterpoint, if you like, with regards to the European Union's ability to be an actor. The first, rather more critical one from Young's, with regards to the European Union being gradually and quite possibly permanently globally irrelevant, or qua Fraser Cameron, that it is in no sense irrelevant. It's just very difficult to characterize it given the very unusual nature of the interlocking institutions that make up the European Union. But if you can categorize it, you see that to some extent it's what he calls a strange superpower. So given those sorts of brief snapshots, I think the next point to think about, therefore, are who are the key actors within European foreign policy, and what interests do they have? Does this include the institutions and the member states, and also individuals, and the kinds of levels that forces us to look about? And also, a bit of an old chestnut, but I think it's a difficult one to get away from, the original dyad by Christopher Hill, the capabilities expectations gap. This, of course, was flagged up in the wake of the Yugoslav crisis and also the construction of the Maastricht Treaty. But it is still, I think, a very salient point, and it is effective bridge building that we have to think about in terms of the European Union's current capabilities and the ongoing expectations. And I think that it is, in fact, a problem in European Union foreign policy. And it certainly, I think, helps give us a direction to putting a practical viewpoint to the conceptual understandings of what is actorness. In this first lecture, I invited you as students, not just of European Union foreign policy, but foreign policy in general, to have at your disposal a range of basic definitions in order to be able to have a variety of clear understandings as to what that entails. And it's an embarras de riche, really, because there are so very many definitions. I've given a couple here. You might remember the first one again is Christopher Hill, the sum total of official outputs of a given unit, usually a state, which is pithy and helpful. I think breaking it down into the moving parts of the state, the actions taken by governments. The third one is an American definition by Valerie Hudson, which you can see has much more a culture and societal viewpoint, the representation of cultural values and political goals of a national society. And then I think a sort of an input-output feeling in the fourth one, the attitude and the goals, if you like, of a nation state, necessary to define and defend interests in the international area. Now, of course, it doesn't really matter which one you choose, as long as you understand the moving parts within it and why you've chosen it. The problem with all of these, of course, is that they don't necessarily apply that well to the European Union. There are a variety of drawbacks. Most of them are a little bit state-centric in a variety of terms, and they make a few assumptions that may not hold when we're flipping it over to look at the European Union in terms of the unified and centralized and coherent sense of a given state and its ensuing national interest and the ability to pursue foreign policy goals. Certainly, given the incredibly interdependent structure of the European Union and the prominent interdependent, very uneasy one in some cases, of foreign policy making within the European Union, it would seem to me wise to have a definition that is flexible enough to incorporate that reality and can accept the idea that you have a political entity that is not necessarily sovereign, but agential, capable of being an actor, capable of producing agency on the world stage, and thereby being effectively a foreign policy actor in its own right. So we are looking for a variety of theoretical plurality, even if it's sort of after the fact, if you like, in order to catch up with the structural plurality that the European Union confronts us with on a daily basis. Again, you have a wide series of EU foreign policy definitions from which you can choose, from Brotherton and Vogler's understanding of actorness, and I'm going to finish up with their three-part understanding of what that entails, to almost more policy-specific ideas of what EU foreign policy can entail. Karen Smith's understanding that it's an emergent process-based dynamic arising from relationships actively and consistently forged between the European Union and other international actors. Whether that's done in a coherent sense certainly remains to be seen. And also the way in which it can spread across broad policy areas: economic, foreign policy, political, security policy, normative definitions as well. And if you like, even foreign policy that can have a geographical dimension, east-west influence and north-south dynamics in addition. So studying European foreign policy, I think, must not necessarily begin with a definitional structure, but from that, I think it's sort of anybody's game as to what you want to put in a course like Quo Vadis. So what you see from then onwards, of course, is history and development and a broad appreciation, I think, of the scope of the EU's ability to have an external impact, to make external activity upon third states. How you judge that and how you measure that, of course, is really rather difficult. You judge it in terms of effectiveness or efficiency or coherence and consistency. I do like the perspective that Brotherton and Vogler give us here, the extent to which the Union has become an actor in internal politics as unique, so it's clear sui generis philosophy, non-traditional and relatively new contender for the status of what they call actorness. And getting to grips with actorness is not terrifically difficult. I think it's simply a combination of the internal attributes and the external factors which allow us to see the European Union marching about on the global stage, sometimes clearly and sometimes in a fit of pique, if I can put it this way. There are three aspects to it, as they say. Presence, which effectively is the ability of the European Union, simply by virtue of existing, the essence, if you like, to be a force, to exert influence beyond its borders, and it certainly denotes structural powers, drawing upon its fundamental philosophies and its motivations. In terms of analyzing, I think you're simply looking at which institutions, which strategies, which policy instruments give us evidence of the EU's ability to act with intent. Capability, of course, is drawn from that presence, and I think is, in a sense, easier to see and easier to study. It is the internal composition, or the toolbox, if you like, of European Union foreign policy. And in terms of saying what to analyze, it is simply what is the composition, what is the makeup of the internal context of the European Union. How does this tell us? How does this denote the type and extent of external action? And the availability of policy instruments, particularly as these can change with the turnover from treaty to treaty. And it means that you as students have to have a clear awareness of the EU's own ability as to what these tools are, how to use them, how to capitalize on them, how to enact its presence, how to enact that first category. So it's really an operationalization, if you like, in terms of that first category. And neither of the two, I think, would be any help unless you had this third category, which of course is opportunity, which tends to come up almost in a sense before presence is established and capabilities have been laid out, at least in treaty fashion. Opportunity, of course, is the door, the window of opportunity that comes up usually when you least expect it, and allows something like the European Union, or indeed any foreign policy actor, to use presence and capability to act or to react to local events and events foreseen or beyond the neighborhood. Of course, what you need to study is the way in which the reaction happens. Is it reaction with logic? Is it opportunistic and realist security-based explanations, or is it more ideational understandings of the logic of appropriateness, reform-driven integrationist logic? The neighborhood, for example, gives us a variety of fairly unhappy logics clashing together. And I think the European Union has been very fortunate to some degree with having a variety, especially since the end of the Cold War, of doors of opportunity opening in front of them. But the way in which they've chosen to capitalize on them, I think, has certainly ranged from good to worse. That brings me to the end of my brief overview of actorness. I just encourage you to look quickly at the quintet of foreign policy tensions, which I think do still abide with regards to the problems of initiating and instantiating EU foreign policy. So I'm going to finish there, and I'm going to turn over to Alexander, who will take you through the merry paths of Realpolitik, Inter-governmentalism, and the national interest.
Okay, a very good afternoon, everyone. As Amelia already mentioned, there are a whole bunch of different theoretical traditions in international relations. So essentially, these different theoretical traditions are all about trying to make sense of the sort of complicated world of international politics. The most ancient of these different theoretical traditions is called realism. And what I will try to do in the next 10 minutes is to give you the sort of very, very brief introduction to how realism tries to make sense of the world of international politics. I'm saying that realism is the most ancient tradition because it's the one that really sort of went hand in hand with the development of the European state system that started off with the treaties of Westphalia in 1648. So in a way, for the realist tradition, the European continent is composed of a bunch of nation states that consider themselves and act as sovereign entities. And in order to trace the sort of evolution of that paradigm, it's sort of useful to simply plug in to the chronology of the different founding fathers of that theoretical tradition. And I've just listed some of the most prominent ones here on this slide. So as many of you will I hope recall from my longer lecture in class, we have Niccolò Machiavelli, the Italian Renaissance philosopher, on the bottom left, writing The Prince, a very famous book about how statesmen should behave, and arguing that it is better to be loved. It's better to be feared than to be loved. So making the case that international politics is very much a game in which ruthlessness plays a very, very important component. Just above, we have Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian diplomat and foreign minister who was instrumental in shaping the idea of the concert of Europe, the sort of diplomatic system that governed the European continent in a fairly organized and well-structured manner in the 17th, 18th century. Then the guy with a big moustache, we have Otto von Bismarck, the German Iron Chancellor. Oh, wait, back to the previous slide. The German Chancellor who was very, very instrumental in actually shaping Germany into a single nation state, which was actually the last one of the big European nation states to enter onto the stage of history, which then from the late in the 19th century onwards triggered this major problem for European politics, namely the German question: is Germany too large to play a role in this concert of Europe system? The three guys on the right are American academics who very much took over the lead in the development of realist thought in the post-war, post-45 era. Actually, the first two were writing their major books right after the First World War. The First War, where the United States actually entered into the matters of war and peace of the European continent. So we have Hans Morgenthau on the top, who got very famous because he coined the idea of the national interest. Nation states pursue national interests. That was a key contribution to how we think about international relations. On the bottom we have Edward Hallett Carr, who came up with the notion of realism as being opposed to utopianism. He said, well, in the study of international relations, there are the people who take the world as it really is, that are the realists, and you have the people who take the world as they believe it should be, and they're the utopians. So all guys who were writing very, very influential books. On the right, on the very far right, I should say, we have Ken Waltz, who arguably most of you will have already heard about him in your previous courses. He's the guy who wrote the theory of international politics, arguably the most famous recent book on international relations. Okay, let me just walk you through the sort of the basic ideas that realists stick to when they are analyzing the world of international affairs. For realists, international politics is all about anarchy. It's a self-help system. So nation states are the most important actors, and they should be thought of as being rational actors that are pursuing what they deem to be their national interests. And you can define these interests in terms of security, in terms of power, in terms of influence. You have all sorts and all different shades of realists, but they all agree on the fact that international politics is a game of power politics where nation states rationally pursue what is their interest. That means that international politics should be thought of as a game in which the balance of power is the overarching analytical concept. Some nation states have a lot of power, others do not have a lot of power, and it's the evolution of this balance that is really the sort of key explanatory mechanism for making sense of the long run of history. I should probably also add, but I guess that has already become clear, that realism is fundamentally conservative and pessimistic in its outlook. This idea of the national interest, you can actually conceptualize it in different manners. You can say, well, some of these interests, they are fairly objective. They concern the geography in which nation states find themselves in. They can also concern economical factors, size of the economy, trade balances. So some of these interests, there are hard facts and figures. But other interests, they are more subjective. They are more open to being interpreted and portrayed in different manners, and that is where issues such as history and culture come in. Of course, both of these types of interests, they frequently overlap and intertwine, in the sense that if you think of, for example, the United Kingdom, one of the very important players in the long run of European politics, well, the United Kingdom, it's an island. That means that it has a specific geographic feature, which means that in terms of its foreign policy, it will be very much reliant on maritime aspects, both in terms of developing its military power, the Royal Navy, as well as being very concerned and attentive to keeping trade lines open and fostering trade overseas as a means of pursuing economic development, which then of course also has cultural implications in the sense of the United Kingdom being more autonomy-minded, but also very liberal-oriented in philosophical terms. Now, if we try to adapt this analytical lens of realism, or Realpolitik, as it sounds so much better in German, I find. If you try to adapt this lens to the post-1945 era, then you can say, well, realism is actually the sort of theoretical foundation for looking at European integration as an intergovernmental game. So European history after 45 should then be analyzed as a game of European cooperation between nation states. So you have in that frame of analysis, you have different national capitals, London, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, Amsterdam, well, everyone, that engage essentially in a bargaining game. They're meeting in various diplomatic fora, and they essentially engage in horse trading. We come to a consensus on this policy. we disagree over other matters. So wherever we agree, we can move forward in terms of developing common policies, eventually leading to common policies in the EU framework. But if there is no agreement on a common policy amongst EU member states, well, then very simple, nothing happens. So this idea that international cooperation is based on an intergovernmental basis, that actually is the sort of standard decision-making logic that characterizes quite a few of the international organizations that we now know. So intergovernmental decision-making, meaning that there needs to be a consensus amongst all members, well, that is how decisions are being made in NATO, that is how decisions are being made in the UN Security Council, with some adaptations, but the permanent members have a veto. And it's also how, very much how the European Union conducts its common foreign and security policy. So this idea of intergovernmentalism, that it's consensus-based decision-making, that is very much considered to be, well, the rule of the game of European foreign policy, at least as interpreted by the realist school of thought. If you want to expand on that a bit further, well, then you can sort of argue, well, there is this diplomatic game that is being played by the different capitals amongst themselves and through the Brussels institutions. So realists would say this European diplomatic service, it's all very nice, but de facto it's also a battleground between the different member states. The different member states, well, they have their own geography, they have their own history and cultural heritage. All of these things still matter, and essentially they're playing the next rounds of the concert of Europe, but simply in a more institutionalized format. And so, just to end with a very, very contemporary example, you may have read in the newspapers that one of the current dossiers that the Foreign Affairs Council is keeping an eye on is the idea whether or not the European Union should engage in should launch an intervention in Mali, where currently northern Mali has de facto succeeded, and you have a bit of a totally chaotic situation that endures, with half of a country being governed by Al Qaeda and allies. Well, the rumor has it that the French and the Germans have struck a secret deal in which the French said, we want to do something about Mali. The Germans said, we don't really want to go to Africa. But the French said, well, if you support us on Mali, then we'll support you on banking supervision, I should say. So two things that are entirely unrelated get linked together in a package deal. Well, we still need to see whether that package deal can be sold to all the other capitals, but that would be sort of illustrative of how the big dossiers, the really high-level political decisions are being made, namely through a game of bargaining amongst the national capitals. Undoubtedly, my colleagues will have some other things to say about that, but that was the very quick introduction to realism. Thank you.
Me. Hello. Let's see if I can work this out. Right. Of course, everything Alexander said is wrong, and it's all about liberalism, the liberal approach. Now, I won't go into that much detail actually in the theoretical background of the tradition. What I will do, I extracted 7 slides, 7 points that looks more at tying in with what we heard at the beginning about actorness and how the EU can try to be an actor, zooming in on what role, assuming that it is an actor in foreign policy. The question is, okay, what kind of actor, what kind of role does it play, and so on and so forth. So the distinction I would like to draw your attention to again is that, of course, when we talk about liberalism or realism or constructivism, all these different theories and different lenses, and the European Union, we have to understand that these theories, as Alexander said, are normally reserved for explaining state behavior. But if we apply them to the EU, we can look at internal and external aspects. Internal aspects, and we now look at the entire history of integration studies, is something for which, of course, the EU got rightly and deservedly the Nobel Peace Prize now, the democratic peace theory and the security community idea. The fact that you bring states together through institutions, that you pool certain aspects of sovereignty, and through that, a community of trust and cooperation between states will bridge the realist jungle that Alexander just outlined. And there is actually a tradition, not unlike the realists that after the Second World War emigrated to the US to look at how state failure and leadership failure leads to a world where trust cannot be maintained. Liberal thinkers or functionalist thinkers also emigrating from the European continent to the US had this counter picture. And here we think about Karl Deutsch, David Matrani, for example, who believe in organizations that they can actually fulfill certain functions that states cannot themselves fulfill, mostly because these functions are related to problems that cross borders, and by definition, if a problem crosses borders, it's no longer possible for one state to control it. So this is a very liberal idea. Tradition, and of course liberalism is the oldest theory here, and the idea that we cooperate on the basis of enlightened self-interest. Yes, we act in a self-interested way, but it's enlightened in a way that we know if we cooperate in the long run, it is better for everyone. This idea of internal aspects of liberalism in the EU also means that EU institutions matter. To what extent they matter, and to what extent they might not matter as much as member states in foreign policy, which is still a very contested area, of course, of national sovereignty, is a different story. But ignoring them ignores quite not only 24,000 people working in Brussels, but it also means ignoring quite important aspects of the EU as a foreign policy actor. The Commission here is important, of course, for anything related to trade. And here member states are very, very limited in their impact. Let's remind ourselves, if Germany decided tomorrow to increase the tariffs on imports of Chinese cars, it can't do so. Why can't it do so? Because the tariffs of Germany and the entire European Union are set by the Commission in cooperation with the Council. So, according to realist thought here, if we think about trade as an important aspect of foreign policy, it's not so possible anymore. But without going into the entire idea of competences, that's just to remind ourselves. There is a question of interdependence. Key liberal thinkers and neoliberal thinkers such as Robert Kahane and Joseph Nye in the 1970s coined this idea of complex interdependence. The idea that whatever happens in one corner of the world will affect, at the end of the day, the other corner and all other states, mostly in the finance and trade world, but also politically speaking. And of course, the financial crisis of today is the best vindication of liberal thought. The idea that the action in the US by a US president in the 1990s to encourage cheap mortgages and to encourage a boom in the building industry, together with the complex systems of the global financial system, will have then, 10 years or 20 years down the line, massive impacts around the world. The complex interdependence theory, from a liberal point, means we're so intertwined in our global politics that it's not enough just to focus on our own borders and, to have this self-help system where we think if we just build up our own power autonomously, we can survive. No, it means if those that manage complex interdependence, that are very good at managing this global dimension, those are the ones that will prevail and survive. So this cooperation aspect of liberalism is the idea of interdependence, and that applies internally also to the EU in some aspects. The idea that if you pool your sovereignty, especially the small member state, you have a higher impact in the world than if you go it alone. The final aspect that draws on liberal tradition is the importance of law. The strong belief from Immanuel Kant, John Locke onwards, Jeremy Bentham in 1880, who first coined the term international law. The idea that what works within the states, i.e. the rule of law, should also be applied between states, hence international law. And that's a very strong aspect, of course, for the European Union. Internally, as we know, it's the strongest supranational legal system in the world, where, apart from the human rights aspects of the European Court of Human Rights of the Council of Europe, separate organization, where you have the strongest European human rights regime, apart from that organization, it's one of the few examples where supranational European law trumps national law. And again, it's a very liberal idea that in some aspects you need to tame member states' unenlightened self-interest through the rule of law. Okay, but let's ignore the internal aspects and actually look at the external aspects, because that's what we're looking at when we look at foreign policy. The idea of liberalism also means there is a certain suspicion towards the use of force and the use of military force. There is now the idea of the 1970s, François Duchesne, who first coined this idea of civilian power. It's not only that you don't use military force, but that you deliberately reject the use of military force. That you think the time where military force matters most in international relations is over. Of course, you have to understand in the historical context. The 1970s was a period of détente. It was a period of superpower relaxation. The confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union was it was an opening for the European Union to play the kind of arbiter, or at least it wanted to play the kind of role of an arbiter between those two blocks. 1970s is also the time when, of course, European political cooperation, as we know it, the beginnings of European foreign policy, started. And this concept François Duchesne put forward with civilian power was then the idea the EU is a new power because it tries to civilize relations between states. Of course, this is a morally difficult concept, especially if we think about it has a kind of ring of this new colonial period of civilizing the former colonies of Europe. But apart from this, the idea is that if you promote international law between states, if you promote the idea of soft power, as we call it now since Joseph Nye coined it in 1989 in an article, the idea that you don't rely on military power, but you rely on persuasion, diplomacy, you invest a lot in trade, because trade is more importantly influencing world politics, then you can actually also structurally change the international system. And that had a revival, this idea of civilian power, with the normative power concept. And that was coined by Ian Manners in 2002, the idea that the EU, in some cases, and he looked at, for example, trade agreements and human rights clauses, or clauses that ask all partners before signing up for a trade agreement to abolish or have a moratorium on the death penalty. If we look at the EU, it seems to do some things for norms or for actual values that might go even against its own self-interest. Why? Because if you insist on human rights clauses in a trade agreement, and if we think, as realists say, that trade is the big self-interest of the EU as a bloc, well, why would you make your life difficult in trade negotiations by inserting and insisting on human rights clauses and on death penalty clauses that might actually annoy your negotiation partner, which you hope to have an agreement with on trade? So that's his key argument. Of course, there are many, many counter-arguments here. Some people say, well, the EU puts human rights clauses in trade agreements not only for show, but also they can use it as a trigger to cancel a trade agreement once it's no longer in its own interest. But what we need to know is that there are arguments out there that try to argue semi-convincingly that the EU holds up liberal values and sacrifices self-interest. Of course, the most clear argument of liberalism is that the EU isn't economic and trade power. Has been a bit reduced now as a result of the financial crisis, but in general, that's where the EU is really, few people would argue that this is where the real power lies. The trade power, the trade bloc, the united position of the EU in trade negotiations. As a result of the 2004 enlargement, another liberal idea was coined, which was the idea of transformative power. Transformative power, coined by Mark Leonard, who now runs the European Council on Foreign Relations, is the idea that, well, compared to empires, where the center state forced the periphery states to join the empire and offered some incentives, maybe like in Roman times, the EU is a transformative kind of empire because other states want to join it and will do painful internal domestic reforms, structural reforms in terms of market economy and liberal democracy to join the European Union's common market, or also to return to Europe in terms of values and European community. Through that, the EU can exert pressure to transform former communist countries or former non-democratic countries into democratic countries with the same standards. The idea Mark Leonard coined was that the EU does it quietly, it does it in the long term, it does it through long-term structural reforms, and it is much more effective than short-term military interventions where you never know whether the outcome actually is better than before the intervention. This idea also plays into this idea of inter-regionalism, where the EU tries to replicate its model in other regions. For example, ASEAN, the Commission has spent a lot of money and time to build up the ASEAN Secretariat. It has spent a lot of money and time on the African Union. The African Union has more or less replicated itself, even though it left out crucial things such as the supranational character of law. But this is the idea that regions, the EU has a kind of model function and replicates itself, and in the future, if you have 4 or 5 or 6 regional organizations that can cooperate, this produces a better outcome for global governance overall. Whether the EU is still a good model is to be questioned. We recently, when we had a workshop on EU Gulf Cooperation Council relations, so the states in the Gulf, 6 states in the Gulf that form also a kind of regional organizations, where there was talk about having a joint common monetary policy as well and a common currency. They are already now in discussion saying, well, maybe we should hold off from further integration, because look what the European Union, what's happening there. The euro obviously is on decline, so maybe it's a bad example and we're holding off. So you also see that this model idea might be under stress now and no longer so convincing. Finally, effective multilateralism and global governance, which I will talk about very briefly in a minute. So here, just the kind of summary again. If we look at, is the EU liberal power, then these concepts and these authors are in a sense arguing, yes, it is a liberal power because it promotes liberal ideas, liberal values, and it does that mostly through the rejection of military force, even though it can use, these authors say, military force as a last resort to promote, again, also liberal values. Here just the summary again of the civilian power aspects, but we went through that already. Normative power summary again, the idea that you don't have to choose between military or civilian tools. The key thing is that the outcome has to be normative, that you establish norms, that you change the international system through promoting certain norms. And these are human rights, democracy, rule of law, which, by the way, are the values that are always mentioned in all texts since the 1970s or 1973, when you first had this Declaration of European Identity, which was the kind of founding document for guidelines for EU foreign policy behavior. His argument is that the EU prioritizes norms in certain aspects over its own self-interest. Again, I say this is contested and debatable, and it uses both military and civilian tools for the promotion of international norms. Just a quick recap also of what we covered in terms of effective multilateralism. That still is one of the guiding foreign policy principles of the EU. Most people don't understand, I think, even in the EU itself, what it really means. So we're still struggling to try to understand it. To put it very short and very briefly, it essentially means, and it was first coined in the European Security Strategy of 2003 and the revision of it and so on, and Catherine Ashton has mentioned this concept in many, many speeches at the UN Security Council and General Assembly. The EU essentially is a very altruistic power because, again, it's not self-interested, because it is there to reinforce other existing organizations. So the key foreign policy priority, and this has been said in many speeches and many documents, is to reinforce the United Nations system and to reinforce, for example, NATO and other organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, in order to equip them to make their job more effective and then contribute indirectly through this to global governance. So to the idea that you manage uncertainty, manage key problems that have a global dimension. And that implies that the EU needs a comprehensive approach. I'm sure you've heard this or you will come across it again, this idea that the EU is unique, so the EU officials say, because it can combine the trade dimensions with the military dimensions, which we have in CSDP, and Alexander talked about the Mali mission, for example, which is the latest attempt to try to join some launch some military operation, and with a civilian humanitarian dimension. Now, the question of whether that's true or not is kind of hotly debated. If we look at the EU's relations with other organizations, especially the UN system, the jury comes to a different conclusion, especially if you ask or if you look at the perspective of those organizations. They feel more and more that the EU takes up more and more tasks without really being very able to manage all these tasks, and by that undermines other organizations. That would be one arguments, especially from the UN system side. But, you know, in other areas, the EU is quite good at supporting other organizations. If you think about the fact that half of the budget of foreign aid and half of also of the UN's program funding comes from the Europeans, that the EU has supported the United Nations peacekeeping operations in the Congo and in Chad, and it's also active off the coast of Somalia. If you look at the relations with NATO, not looking so good, because more or less the NATO and the EU had a relationship where NATO wasn't unsure whether the EU is duplicating it or undermining it, and the relationship now, after a good start in 2003, is absolutely a stalemate. And there is suspicion that if a CSDP builds up more and more military dimension and momentum, that it might come into direct competition and rivalry with NATO. And also the question is, if the EU works with other organizations, is it really to support those organizations, or is it in the short run to use those organizations to build up its own profile, its own visibility, and its own activeness? Especially in Libya, for example, we have now a situation where the EU is very, very keen on getting involved in a border management mission there, but actually the United Nations mission, UNSMIL, is in kind of tasked by the Security Council, by the global institution, to deal with all aspects of the rebuilding of Libya. And there are very, very strong inter-organizational rivalries and a push by many EU actors to be visible. And if you think about visibility and this idea that, well, the EU needs to show that it's an important international actor and an important, relevant, liberal actor, you run the danger that you do many things just for show without lasting impact. And in the process of that, you might also very much annoy and undermine the efforts of other organizations. So this is an important aspect I want to leave you with. Why? Because global governance itself is the key liberal concept. It is the key idea that nation states need to pool their resources effectively through organizations to really address major problems like climate change, like economic governance, but also peace and security. And the question we have to ask ourselves as analysts is, if the EU, whenever the EU launches an international mission, is it really or has it got a coherent approach that really promotes an impact on that global issue, or is it more or less to reinforce its own institutions' own self-interest? Let's see what constructivism has to say about that.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for sort of talking already about norms and some of the concepts that the constructivists are concerned with. And so I guess I'll be brief to leave some time for questions. What I'd like to do is really to run very quickly through the main concepts of constructivism, and in particular how that differs from the two theoretical approaches that Joe and Alexander presented. So the big difference actually is national interests are not fixed. So the idea of constructivism is actually that individuals construct the world and that they have different perspectives of the world. They perceive the world in different manners, in different ways. They can perceive some countries as threats or friends. So what I just put up on this slide is I found that on the internet, and it's a caricature about American world. So this could be the way how Americans would see the world and perceive different continents and countries. And then I found another one which would portray the world seen from the French perspective. So you can already see the way how you construct the world from your own perspective, how you perceive it, can be very different. So, and that's the main argument, or the main difference between constructivism and the other theoretical approaches. So, and Alexander Wendt, for example, says anarchy is what states make of it. So Alexander already said that the realists really talk about anarchy and states pursuing their national interests and trying to survive in the anarchy. And Wendt says, no, it's actually what states make of it, how they perceive it, and in that way they construct the social reality. So they say it's not objective, it's really what each actor makes out of it. And then, of course, these perceptions have to be widely shared to actually have an influence. So while the realists and the neo-realists really would look at power and interests which are given, so they wouldn't look at why and how these interests change. And that's one of the focuses that constructivists would look at. So they would look at what are the ideas and beliefs about the world and how can they also change over time. So they're rather mental constructs than fixed factors. If you look at constructivism as an international relations theory, as I already said, for neo-realists, identities and interests are given. But what you would look at from a constructivist point of view is really how these interests and identities are created through interaction between different states. So states actually interact with each other, get to know each other, negotiate with each other, and through these, or also in economic terms, interact with each other. And that is something that the liberals would look at and subscribe to as well. So interaction through states actually shapes and determines whether a state perceives another state as an enemy or as a friend or as a rival. And depending on how you perceive another state, your reaction and your foreign policy obviously differs as well. So we can't necessarily predict just from these very objective given criteria as a realist would say, but rather it's about what we see, how we experience another state. And then we have authors like Martha Finwar who bring in norms and international organizations, and that's two aspects that Joe already talked about, and they play a big role in a lot of the constructivist thinking as well. So basically, one big difference that between realism and constructivism is the role of international organizations, which are also acknowledged by the liberalists. So international organizations are autonomous actors. They don't only serve the self-interest of states, but they're actually actors in their own right. And so they're actors in their own right, which means that they can also construct the environment in which states cooperate with each other. And they can, for example, also promote norms and try to influence the behavior and the perception of certain states to try to converge certain perceptions of states towards each other. And so we have these international organizations that transmit norms and through that shape national policy as well. And then in addition to this international perspective, we of course also have the domestic factors, and that's something, well, that comes in also in this normative power of the EU, pursuing norms, basing its foreign policy on norms. So this would be domestic factors. States, having different, widely shared norms that they base their foreign policy action upon, but then also history and some other of the factors that were mentioned earlier as well. One big criticism in international relations theory is that, and that would come from realists, is that constructivism actually does not deal with a problem of uncertainty about future intentions of states. So realists would say that states are always cautious because they're not sure how a state would react in the future. They could in the future always decide to go to war. And so there's always this uncertainty, and the constructivists actually don't deal with that. They, they would say through interaction, actually we sort of perceive some states as friends, and then we're all friendly with them. So that would be one of the another of the main differences, how we can sort of try to understand these different theories, and then trying to look at European integration. Constructivism is not a European, an EU integration theory. there you would have the intergovernmentalism and functionalism, and I'm sure we all read a lot about them. But constructivism does have some elements that you can also find, and especially the functionalist theory, but also it can contribute to explain certain factors of European integration. Maybe not so much about the inception and the initial point of integration when states decide, but now in the process of the EU existing and further integrating, there's some aspects actually that you could take from constructivism that shed additional light into some aspects, and that is in particular, if you look at intergovernmentalism and functionalism, that's very much actor-focused, while constructivists would look at the interaction between actors and structure. So you sort of have these feedback effects between institutions and actors that could actually be a point that could contribute to European integration or to understanding European integration at the moment. So basically what you would have is looking at actors that work in EU institutions, interact with each other, socialize with each other, and through this regular interaction actually slowly, incrementally change their perception of certain issues, their norms, maybe the way in which they perceive issues. So here we again would have the construction of how you would see and perceive certain issues, and not just a fixed interest that never changes. So, and there's a lot of studies looking at, for example, commission officials, whether or not and how they would change their behavior, their attitude throughout their careers, and whether this continuous interaction actually changes their the way they perceive certain EU policy issues and the way they make policy if they're in such a position. And another thing that constructivists can bring to European integration or understanding European integration, that's the whole issue of European identity. So through interaction, through understanding and perceiving certain issue in a similar way, you also can create this European identity as opposed, or in addition to a national identity of different EU member states. So this would be another issue that, where the constructivists could actually contribute and put additional aspects to the an analysis of EU integration. And if you look at the making of EU foreign policy, you have some studies, for example, by Michael Smith, that look at the day-to-day interaction, the practices of political cooperation, which shapes common views, mutual coordination, and then also influences the way in which foreign policy is made in Brussels. And this looks rather at the technical level, which would also resonate with the functionalist point of view, rather than the really high-level political interaction and discussions that Alexander spoke about. And in class, I very briefly referred also to Europeanization literature, which also is about socialization, social learning amongst member states, and then actually changing the own way in which they make their national position. And then that recently moved into researching also the impact of the European Union outside of its border. So very briefly to sum up, that I guess it's very easy to contrast constructivism with realism, and there are more overlaps with the liberalism, especially when it comes to the independent role of international organizations and also the interdependence. I think one difference between the liberalism and the constructivism is that liberalism is a rational choice theory. So liberalism looks at reductions of transaction costs and more the logic of consequences, while constructivism is based on the logic of appropriateness, so much more the way, norms and the way how you perceive issues as appropriate. So that's very briefly and quickly summing up a big literature on, with many nuances actually that I didn't mention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katja, and thank you to Joachim and also to Alexander. I'm just going to put the next slide up while we're thinking about doing some questions now, because we have about 10 minutes between now and 1:15, and we've had a few questions put on the chat box in the lower left-hand side of your screen, so do continue to type those up. We've got one from Olivier, which I think Katja might be able to weigh in on. But now is the time, if you'd like to pitch in using the video. You certainly simply just need to press the two buttons on the upper left-hand side underneath the screen square, the one saying talk and the one saying video as well. So do go ahead if you'd like to. Now is the time to do that. Or again, as I said, if you want to type a question into the chat box in the lower left-hand side. And while you're ruminating on the wide aspects of the connections between international relations theory and European foreign policy, again, just do please have a look at the slide here with regards to part 2 on the 5th of December, looking at each in turn of the European Union institutions. My own lecture this Friday sets the stage. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, between pillars and posts, starting with Maastricht and then, of course, roaring all the way to Lisbon and beyond, to look at the implications of each of these successive treaties in terms of how it has endowed the European Union with a presence, very much also with regards to its capabilities and the way in which it's being able to act and react to various opportunities as well. That'll be followed by a review of the European Council and the Commission and the Parliament as well, in that particular order. So I'm waiting to see if I can hear or see any particular interest. It does take perhaps a modicum of courage to click on these particular buttons and stick your hand up. Again, you can raise your hand by tapping the little hand icon, and then we can switch off and switch over to you. So I just want to quickly scroll through and make sure that I'm not missing any hands in this virtual classroom of ours. I don't see anybody at present. Certainly, it's been a very comprehensive tour d'horizon of international relations. Roman has another question underneath, I think. I'll just read this out. What do you think about the diminishing of state sovereignty, especially in the security dimension in our day? What would be the future of sovereignty in a mentioned domain, i.e. security, as the main element of international relations when that still remains the unit? I think you mean still remains the state. I suppose that international organizations will further pull over or intervene in state security. Joe, do you want to have a whack at that one?
Yeah, sure. Interesting question. Well, I mean, it's a huge question as well. If we think about the EU, what's happening at the moment in the security domain, we'll see something we can call sub-regionalization. So what is happening is that states to see more and more that the EU as a whole doesn't work in security. Why? Because you have 27 member states. Most member states don't even agree. I mean, even the big three, Germany, France, England, are mostly on different planes when it's about intervening somewhere. Germany mostly very reluctant. If you think about civilian power, that's more or less Germany. Very reluctant to using military force or getting involved anywhere where it doesn't perceive really direct interest. And France and Britain being more interventionist, something also panning out that did really paralyze the EU in the Libya case. Germany, under no circumstance, wanted an intervention. France and Britain were pushing for it, and at the end of the day, it was NATO that took over. And in Syria, we have similar ideas. Instead, what's happening? Those member states that really want to push forward. I mean, at some point, we had a discussion about a European army. I mean, I know Daniel Cohn-Bendit, a prolific member of the European Parliament, is going to give a speech in Hamburg next week on that now we need a European army because Syria is on fire, there's genocide, and if we don't have a European army, then nation states will continue to play their little games at the expense of, human beings being killed elsewhere. And again, liberalism takes the idea that we should worry if any human being is being killed anywhere, whether it's in our own states, whether it's our own nationality or not, because we are common humanity. And to come back, what is happening now is that states in the EU are actually pooling more or less some of their sovereignty or their complete sovereignty sub-regionally. So the Belgians and the Dutch, they are going very far now, for example, in combining their naval forces. I mean, what's happening informally now is whenever the Belgians send a battleship or any naval forces to an EU mission off the coast of Somalia, which is the anti-piracy mission there, Atalanta, normally Dutch officers are on the Belgian boats and Belgian officers are on the Dutch boats, and they actually have a unified naval command now. This is also something that's happens in the Nordic countries. Sweden, Finland, and Norway, even though Norway is not part of the EU, very much pool their defense policies and security policies, and they were the ones that went furthest, for example, in the battle group concept, which is an EU concept that was started in 2003 and was supposed to be a compromise to not have a massive armed force, but at least have, member states coming together in groups of 5 states to really pool their resources for rapid reaction interventions that could have been used in Libya or Syria. But the battle groups have never been used so far. And the sub-regionalization is happening between Germany and the Dutch and Holland, the Netherlands, sorry. It's happening between Germany, Poland, France, and Mediterranean states, Italy and Portugal. And strangely, it's happening between France and Britain. Very, very far reaching cooperation now, both in defense purchasing and defense industry, but also there was a plan to adjust, for example, the aircraft carriers of the Brits to that extent that French aircraft could operate on them. It was a bit more difficult than assumed, so they're on hold at the moment, but it shows how far the cooperation of what we think on the surface are two completely opposing member states in their approach to the EU, how far their pragmatic cooperation in the security field are actually advancing. Okay, if member states are now cooperating more closely at a sub-regional level, i.e. below the EU institutional level, what does that mean for the EU? What does it mean for the EU foreign policy? Those member states say it's going to help the EU because we're not going to be held back anymore by 27 member states having to make a unified decision, which takes so much time and will never work. But if small groups of states, coalitions of the willing, advance their security cooperation, this will benefit as a whole the EU. I'm more skeptical because at the end of the day, it will probably undermine the EU's common security approach if it's not really linked to the common EU institutions. We have the EU military staff, we have the EU military committee that are normally should be kind of monitoring crisis and promoting a unified EU security policy for all member states, but they're really not involved, for example, in these sub-regional arrangements. So it's an interesting time. Let's see what's happening, at least in the EU. And I don't think at the moment member states are keen to pool their sovereignty. I think we're seeing a kind of fallback really to a renationalization of many policies and politics. I mean, just follow the budget negotiations right now, and the UK really playing hardball, and you have the good old national bargaining. I think Alexander's inter-governmentalist approach and realist approach is probably a better explanation of what's happening there.
Thanks very much, Joe. I think that now brings to an end our first Jean Monnet webinar for the Quo Vadis module. I'd like to thank everybody who has signed in online. Looking at some of the comments going back and forth, it's clear that you're able to multitask in terms of getting on with some other work, also possibly having lunch and learning at the same time. And indeed, I'm sure that's the philosophy behind blended learning, and certainly things like these webinars help support that. So just a reminder to note in your agenda the 5th of December, remember, for Actors in Play, and for those of you formally taking the European Union Foreign Policy class, that this Friday's lecture will start the second part 2 of the course. There's quite a bit of reading, as you've seen. I've updated it. So do please do as much as you can of the required readings, because as usual I'm going to speak at my normal slow speed for the entire hour, and we have 2 presentations afterwards, and they're going to be all pretty substantive. Thank you very much for joining. I'll see most of you on Friday and the rest of you on the 5th of December. Have a good day. Thanks.